I've been charged as the seminary professor in the room to speak a bit about what these 50 years mean for ministerial preparation in the future of the church. In my other capacity, I serve also as the Director of African American Church Studies at Wesley Seminary, and this semester in particular, we've had the opportunity to sojourn to Memphis in February. In fact, a week and a half after the start of the strike 50 years ago, we were present and actually heard from the surviving persons who were the sanitation workers there. So in good, and I'm also Baptist, which means I have 3 points. And or him, yes. But I think there are 3 distinct ways we can draw meaning. And the first is that there are some key lessons to learn about the Memphis sanitation workers strike. Most of us outside of the city of Memphis understand the sanitation workers strike to be the occasion by which Dr. King was assassinated. However, in hearing from and walking and speaking to the living history that was present in Memphis, there was a real movement happening there. And the lesson from the Memphis sanitation workers strike is that there is an intersection between civil rights, economic rights, and human dignity. And let me just offer you, this comes from a wonderful book, and if you don't have it, you need to get it, especially if you're a student of history. Going Down Jericho Road, the Memphis Strike, Martin Luther King's last campaign, by historian Michael K. Honey. He opens the book with, I'm just going to read a little bit of it, that highlights the level of indignity that was present in Memphis in the 1960s as it relates to public servants, trash workers. At the end of a miserable cold workday, Echo Cole, 36, and Robert Walker, 30, have their soiled, worn-out clothes smelling of garbage, for the city did not provide them gloves, uniforms, or a place to shower. They did hard, heavy work, lifting garbage tubs and carrying them on their shoulders or heads or push carts to dump their contents into outmoded, broken-down trucks. On this particular day, Cole and Walker rode in a precarious, stinky perch between a hydraulic ram used to mash garbage into a small wad and the wall of the truck's cavernous container. So they're inside the container of the truck. Between the ram, you've seen the ram on garbage trucks that crushes the garbage. They're in a space between that because there was no way to sit them in, they weren't allowed to sit inside the cab. As Crew Chief Willie Crane drove the loaded garbage packer along Colonial Street to the Shelby Drive dump, he heard the hydraulic ram go into action. Perhaps set off by a shovel that had jarred loose and crossed some electrical wires, he pulled the truck over to the curb at 4:20 p.m., but the ram already was jamming Cole and Walker back into the compaction. One of the men lurched forward and nearly escaped, but the ram snagged his raincoat and dragged him back. One horrified woman who saw what happened said he was standing there on the end of the truck and suddenly it looked like the big thing just swallowed him whole. Cole and Walker died that day. That was February 1st, 1968. Those deaths highlighted for the city and for the sanitation workers the lack of care for these public servants. Some quick statistics about Memphis in 1968. It was 40% African American, but 58% of those African Americans lived in poverty, at or below the poverty level. The average sanitation worker's salary was 96 cents an hour. By the time the strike was in full mode, the rate of pay was $1.80 an hour, 20 cents below the federal poverty level. One man, Ed Gillis, who had been working for 20 years as a sanitation worker, made $7.80 a day. They were called to haul 50-pound plus tubs of garbage in the rain, sleet, snow, and flooding weather of Memphis, Tennessee, sweltering weather of Tennessee. What we learned from Memphis is that the strike was not about money. It was about dignity. That these were human beings that the city was counting on to take their trash. 96% of the staff of the DPW, of the garbage workers themselves, were African American because whites did not want to do it. The whites did the hiring and they managed the shops and the bus barns, but blacks went out and took care of the trash. No one paid attention to them, but no one bothered to listen to their cries. And so what I learned from an individual like Bill Lucy was the first person on the scene after the death of the sanitation workers from the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, otherwise known as AFSCME, which took the lead in the actual strike. But we were able to sit and talk to Bill Lucy at length. And he told us about how they came up with I Am a Man, that iconic symbol of the strike. It was because the sanitation workers overwhelmingly weren't talking about money. They were talking about, do they see me? And for us in theological education and as Christians, this is the most important element of what I believe is the witness of the gospel. That if Jesus Christ became human, then surely part of our responsibility is to see one another's humanity in its fullness. And the struggle we have in the church is that we don't want our Jesus to be human. That's why we don't come to Good Friday services, by and large. Maybe not in Annandale, but in other places. We struggle with humanity. So if we can't look on a Jesus who is dying on a cross, we certainly can't look at Michael Brown laying in the street, or Freddie Gray being tossed around in the back of a van, or garbage workers who get killed in the back of a truck. There are lessons there, that there's intersectionality between civil rights, class distinctions, and human dignity. A second lesson that we would take away is that from the Kerner Commission itself, the most controversial line in the entire 600-page report was the statement from the report that white racism is, quote, white racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II, end quote. It was a reality. Johnson had the whole thing, President Johnson had the whole thing trashed. But the reality is that the statement still holds true to this day. And I would add to that, from the church perspective, that we as the Christian church, particularly white Christian, white Protestantism, must also come to grips with the reality that the white racism that has gripped our society has been perpetuated by Christianity, white Christianity in America. It's a hard thing to come to grips with. But the truth of the matter is that most white churches, regardless of denomination, I know we like to pick on the Southern Baptists all the time, but regardless of denomination, participated in and in many cases supported segregationist practices. I have to remind Methodists that one of the signers to Dr. King, to which Dr. King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail, was a United Methodist bishop, to which Dr. King was speaking against. And so what we must do as the Christian church is that if we participated in building it, we must also participate in dismantling it. And the people who are the descendants of the builders must be willing to participate in its dismantling. And that is the part and ownership, and this may sound weird, that is the grace of God. that God gives us another chance to get it right. And the grace of God is always difficult for everybody to receive. But it's our responsibility to be able to do that. The last thing I would say is that the movement that comes from the death of Dr. King and subsequently from the intersectionality of the strike itself is that we must diversify our dialogue about God. That there has to be a distinctiveness in our theological discourse. From the academy side, our charge is to equip, prepare, and here's the hard part, push our mother church to be its best self from the thinking side. If God said to love God, if Jesus said that we are to love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul, then theology is loving God with your mind. That's one of the quotes from Dr. James Cone, who we heard from earlier. Theology is loving God with your mind. And the seminary, the theological school, is the place where we seek to teach you to do that better. And our love needs to be diversified. That means being willing to explore theologies and beliefs and practices that challenge our own. The discourse of black theology, of liberation theology, of womanist and feminist theology, while they all have their particular slants and purposes, they ultimately seek to reflect on the distinctiveness of Jesus Christ. And while the traditional area of theology was with white Germans mostly in the 19th century and early 20th century, the idea of liberational movements is to push that and say, we're not just thinking about the work of Christ, but the body of Christ. That if God could be incarnated as anything, God chose to be a first century Palestinian Jew under Roman oppression. What does that mean? That's the purpose of liberation theology. And so, James Cone, for example, would say it means that God is a God who always sides with the oppressed. And being a Christian means we should be always looking for the oppressed and siding with them. Other theologians have different perspectives about that, but I say this to say that in a time in which we bristle against distinctiveness, Black Lives Matter or Me Too, the distinctiveness of these are not negations of someone else, but it's a call to the distinctiveness of Jesus being who Jesus is in our life. That God chose a distinctive body, a distinctive time, a distinctive place, right? So that when we go into the world, all of us, we have our own distinctions, our own particularities. Those aren't meant to be degradations of something else, but instead are calling us to be attentive to what God is doing in that community, in that place, at this particular time. That's our struggle. That's the lesson here. That's what we have to carry forward. And frankly, it's the historical charge of our ancestors, regardless of ethnicity. What will we do with what we've been passed down? And so I leave you with that. There's more to be said, but certainly we want to have time for discussion. So I'll stop right there.